He went to save himself, but instead saved an Apache woman's land. The desert sun had started its cruel work before noon, a merciless white fire rolling down from the iron-red peaks of the Dust Devil Canyon mountains. And by the time Red-Eye Riker realized how fast the wind was whipping up the gritty earth, the sand was already thick enough to wipe out the faint tracks of the man he was hunting. He had been chasing the bounty, a small-time crook named Silas, since first light, traversing through dry washes and brittle sagebrush in a desperate effort to reach the next waterhole before the heat killed them both. He had stayed too long, thinking he could endure one more mile, but the air shifted, and the sky turned a churning, ochre brown. Now the desolate landscape was nothing but jagged rock, hidden in a swirling, choking cloud of sand, and the heat pressed into his lungs until every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Riker pushed forward through drifts of fine, burning dust that reached to his calves, his heavy, worn boots slipping and fighting for purchase. His bandana was already soaked through with sweat, offering no defense against the invasive grit, and he kept adjusting the worn leather of his Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, its weight a constant, heavy reminder of his burden. He was used to the harsh sun, used to being alone in the open west. But this dust storm was a living thing, worse than most, and he knew it could swallow a man whole if he didn't find cover. His horse, a sturdy but weary roan named Judge, had bolted hours earlier, spooked by the wind and the sudden gusts of blinding sand. Riker hadn't had the heart or the strength to chase it. The poor beast was likely already lost, a ghost in the swirling red haze. He had only the worn pack on his back with a nearly empty canteen, a bit of rancid salted pork, and a handful of rounds for the Colt. He cursed the desert's indifference under his breath when his boot caught on a shard of shale, and he went down hard on both knees. Pain shot up his thigh, the muscle already raw from days of riding and walking. He gritted his teeth, the taste of blood mixing with the dust in his mouth, and forced himself back up. He had been alone for years, ever since the whole damned cavalry regiment had been dismissed after that ugly incident near the Washita River, an incident that Riker could not stop replaying in his mind. The sight of a small Apache camp, the unnecessary violence, the silent face of a woman he should have protected but hadn't. He knew well enough that no one was coming for a bounty hunter on the run if he didn't keep moving. He had told himself long ago that he didn't need anyone, that the pursuit of justice, even a solitary, blood money kind of justice, was enough. That the silence of the desert was preferable to the damning noise of men. But storms like this had a way of stripping a man bare, of making him doubt his own hardened stubbornness. Through the choking brown haze, he saw a dark shape, a jagged line against the swirling earth. He squinted, eyes stinging and tearing up from the relentless grit. It was a ruin, a thick wall of sun-baked mud brick and stone, the remains of an old Spanish mission, or perhaps a forgotten Tohono O'odham house. Just to the right, a dark square cut into it, a doorway. Relief hit him hard, a sudden, unexpected loosening of the tension that had been a tight knot in his chest for weeks. He leaned forward, half stumbling, half dragging himself across the wind-scoured earth until he reached it. The wind screamed at his back, sand driving sideways like hot shrapnel, but inside the thick walls was a sudden, blessed break from the storm's fury. The silence inside the adobe ruin was thick, almost suffocating after the cacophony outside. Riker pulled the damp bandana down and shook out dust from his thick, sand-caked beard. His eyes adjusted slowly. At first, he thought he saw nothing but crumbling mud walls and utter darkness. But then the faintest glow of firelight, a low, controlled ember, flickered against the rough stone deeper in. He stopped dead in his tracks. There was someone inside. A small, almost invisible fire burned low near the far wall, and beside it sat a woman. Her dark hair was long, braided tight, falling loose over her shoulder, and a woven cotton shawl, faded to the color of bone, covered most of her body. Beneath it, he caught the edge of a deerskin dress beadwork dulled with age, the fabric torn at the shoulder so that part of her collarbone was visible in the shifting, weak light. She sat very still, a figure carved from the shadows, but her eyes large, dark brown, and steady were locked on him the instant he stumbled through the opening. In her hand, held tight against her thigh, was not a stone, but a piece of polished obsidian, a tool or a weapon, its edges wickedly sharp. Riker raised both hands slowly, his Colt still holstered and untouched, but his heart hammered against his ribs a sound that felt loud and crude in the silence. He had expected emptiness, maybe a curled-up coyote or a rattlesnake, but not this. A woman alone, deep in the forgotten ruins of the desert. "I don't mean harm," he said, his voice low, rough from the dust-choked air and lack of water. "Storm's bad. Just need a corner to wait it out." She said nothing. Her stare did not soften. She pulled the shawl higher across her chest, a gesture of instinctive, desperate protection, but her grip on the obsidian did not waver. Riker shifted his weight, uncertain. He could feel the residual heat still eating into him, the sweat drying cold on his back. His tongue felt like leather, his throat raw. He didn't have the strength to turn back into the storm, not with the light failing, filtered to a sickly orange by the sand. He stayed where he was, palms open, breathing hard. His mind worked quick. She was Tohono O'odham, a desert people, known for their skill in finding water and navigating the treacherous rockways. He knew enough from the structure of the ruins, the deep respect for the scarcity of water, the fine weave of her shawl. He had seen the way white men, miners, settlers, and even the damned cavalry had treated the indigenous women in the past, treating them as spoils, or worse, as obstacles to be removed. The thought sat heavy in his gut, stirring a deep, corroding shame for things he'd witnessed and, in his youth and foolish obedience, done nothing to stop. The memory of the woman at Washita, her silent, condemning stare, was a phantom in the corner of his eye. But this was no camp. This was one woman alone, surviving in the heart of a ruin. A desert rose, thriving in the broken, cracked earth. The embers of the small fire crackled, the sound sharp in the dense silence. Her eyes never left him. Riker felt his own jaw tighten, the muscles standing out beneath his beard. He wanted to explain, to tell her his name, why he was here. But words felt useless, cheapened by years of men's lies. He thought of turning and leaving, braving the final, killing hours of the storm rather than risking whatever this confrontation was. But the image of that long-dead woman came back to him. If he walked out of this ruin now, leaving a vulnerable woman to her fear and the mercy of chance, he would be condemning himself again. So he lowered his hands and took a single, deliberate step back toward the crumbling adobe wall, not forward. He set his pack down on the dusty stone floor, slow and meticulous, showing his empty, open palms. Then he eased himself down to sit, keeping the distance between them. For a long time, neither moved. The storm roared outside, but inside there was only the flickering glow and the sound of her measured breath. Riker understood. Honor in this moment meant proving he was harmless. He was the intruder, and if he wanted to survive this storm, it would not be by force. It would be by respect. The woman finally shifted. "Ayana," she spoke, a warning and an offering. Riker lifted his head, meeting her eyes. Riker. He leaned back against the wall. For now, survival was all that mattered. The storm did not let up through the late afternoon. It screamed against the thick, crumbling walls outside, pressing sand against the narrow opening, until the world beyond was nothing but hot, gritty white noise and shifting shadows. Inside, the embers burned low, throwing a faint orange glow across the stone, and the silence seemed to press in on Riker's ears. He sat against the far side of the ruin, his back to the rough wall, boots stretched out before him, watching the woman without staring too hard. She hadn't moved much since he entered. Her shawl was drawn high over her shoulders, her knees tucked close, the obsidian still resting on her thigh, though her grip had clearly eased. In the dim light, he could see the elegant structure of her face, the quiet fortitude in her posture, the weariness that belied her youth. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps barely past 20, yet her eyes carried something much older, years of loss or fear carved into them, the mark of the frontier's casual cruelty. Riker knew enough of the territory, especially near the mining town of Dust Devil Canyon, to guess at the truth. The Tohono O'odham people, like others, had been scattered, their lands coveted for water and mineral rights. He'd seen the signs: forced labor, theft of land, women left with nothing. Looking at her now, it wasn't hard to understand why she had chosen this forgotten ruin. It was hidden, dry, and maybe near some secret reserve of water. She had probably been here for a short time, maybe weeks, carefully conserving every resource. His stomach tightened with a sudden, painful hunger, but a different kind of ache also flared, the awareness of their shared, precarious situation. He thought of his own supplies. He reached for his pack slowly, careful not to make the movement look like a threat or a grab. She tensed, eyes narrowing, but when he pulled out a strip of his rancid hard pork jerky and broke it in half with a quick snap, her grip on the obsidian faltered. Just for a moment, he set the larger piece on the ground between them, pushing it toward her with the heel of his boot, and then bit into the smaller half himself. The sound of his chewing echoed too loud in the tense silence, a grinding commentary on their mutual desperation. She didn't touch her piece at first. She studied him, his face, his scar, the red-rimmed exhaustion in his eyes, then the offering of meat weighing whether this was a trick, a softening before the inevitable demand. Only after a long, agonizing pause did she reach out, her fingers quick, snatching it into the folds of her shawl. She ate with small, almost fearful bites, never looking away from him. Riker chewed slower now, the dryness of the jerky scraping his throat. He reached for his canteen, uncapped it, took a single, controlled swallow of the warm, metallic-tasting water, then slid it across the stone toward her. She hesitated again, then lifted it, tilting the water to her lips. She drank only a small amount, a sip that was probably the most vital thing she had done all day, before handing it back with a faint, almost imperceptible trembling in her hand. The moment was nothing, just water and salt. But to Riker, it felt heavier than any spoken oath. He let out a slow, careful breath, realizing he'd been holding it, waiting for her rejection. The hours dragged on until the last of the outside light failed completely. He tried to rest, closing his eyes, but the cold stone floor and the weight of her watchful silence kept him half awake, alert. When he opened them again, the fire was guttering, near death. She was moving now, adding a small, dry bundle of scrub wood from a dark corner of the ruin. He hadn't noticed the pile before. She must have gathered it ahead of the storm, knowing the desert's temper. She crouched near the flames, her shawl slipping to reveal more of her shoulder, the fine, sun-darkened skin catching the firelight, pale against the dark fabric. Riker forced his eyes away, a wave of shame washing hot through him. He busied himself with his own thoughts, remembering how he had come to this valley in the first place. After his court-martial, he had drifted from town to town, always moving deeper into the Badlands, away from people, away from the judgmental noise of towns that reminded him too much of the man he failed to be. Bounty hunting gave him purpose, a twisted, solitary form of justice. Tracking a man, bringing him in, it was something he could control. But nights were long, and the silence was heavy, and he had no answer for that pervasive emptiness except the coldness of his pistol and the promise of work. Until now. She broke the silence first. Her voice was quiet, rough from disuse and the dust, but startlingly clear. Ayanna, she spoke the name, each syllable like a small, precious stone, an offering and a warning all at once. Riker lifted his head, meeting her eyes. He let the name roll from his tongue carefully, testing the sound. Ayanna. Then he pointed to himself. Riker. Her gaze flickered, considering the scar above his eye, the red of his exhaustion, and the lethal grace of his shoulders. Then she dipped her head once in acknowledgement. That was all. Yet in the ruin, with the storm pressing its hot breath against the adobe walls, it felt like an ancient pact. They did not speak again for what felt like hours. When the fire sank too low, Riker slowly stood. She stiffened, the obsidian back in her grip, but he only walked to the narrow opening. The sand had piled high, but not completely sealed it. He pushed through with his boots, breaking away the drift, and gathered what brittle, dry scrub he could find, just under the small stone ledge where the wind had less purchase. His hands were raw, his fingers numb from the heat. He stacked the armful of frozen branches near the fire, squatting down to break them into smaller pieces. She watched him the whole time, her shawl pulled close, her face a mask of careful neutrality. He wondered what she saw. A white man in her refuge, scarred and dusty, eyes red from the grit. An intruder, yes, but also a man who had brought firewood instead of violence. When the flames finally rose again, the small ruin filled with a welcome, meager warmth. Riker leaned back against the wall, bone-deep exhaustion pulling at his body. He caught her eyes for a moment, steady and dark, and for the first time, she did not look away immediately. In that look was no trust yet, but neither was there outright rejection. Only the unspoken truth. The storm had trapped them together. Whatever either of them carried, grief, loss, fear, the crushing weight of a forgotten honor, it would have to wait. Survival came first. Later, as the fire burned down to embers, Riker drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep, his Colt within reach, the storm howling like a betrayed animal outside. Ayanna sat awake longer, her eyes still on him, weighing whether this large, silent man who stumbled into her hiding place would bring danger or something else entirely. For the first time in many months, she wasn't entirely sure what she wanted to believe. The man was a deserter. She could see it in the scar and the haunted eyes, but he had offered his last water. That, in the desert, was a sign of a strange and deep honor. And from here, the rest is Riker's own voice. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The single piece of pork jerky and the shared water had created an invisible bond, a fragile thread of trust that hung between us in the dusty air of the ruin. I woke with my neck stiff, feeling the phantom ache of the rope that should have been around my neck years ago, convinced I was still a man running from his past. My eyes opened to find the ruin washed in dim, filtered light seeping past the sand-choked entrance. The worst of the storm was finally passing, leaving behind a silence that was more unnerving than the roar. For a moment, I forgot where I was. My body braced, as if I were still in the cavalry camp, waiting for the sergeant's whistle and the shouts of men. But there were no voices here, only the low, steady sound of wood crackling and the faint shift of fabric. Ayanna was crouched by the embers, her shawl draped around her shoulders, carefully feeding small twigs into the flames. Her hair, dark and heavy, fell forward, nearly brushing the heat. She turned slightly at the sound of my movement, her eyes steady, not startled, but fiercely watchful. I pushed myself upright, joints aching, and drew in the sharp, dry air. The jerky I had given her the night before was gone, only a faint, oily residue left on the stone. I noted the way she avoided glancing at my pack, as if to make clear she hadn't touched more than what I'd offered. Something about that sat heavy and solid in my chest. It was a fierce discipline, a personal honor that matched the harshness of her desert. I reached inside, pulled out the last strip of salted pork wrapped in cloth, and set it between us. I tore a piece off for myself, a minuscule portion, and chewed, then nodded toward the rest. After a pause, she reached forward and took it, her fingers quick, pulling it back into her shawl. I broke the silence first, my voice rough, not used to conversation. "How long you been hiding?" She studied me, then tilted her head toward the ruin's opening. Since the sun turned cold, the words were few, her English halting, but clear enough. "Alone?" She nodded once. The weight of it settled in my gut, heavier than any pack. A woman alone in this forgotten place for months, surviving the heat, gathering the scarce wood, hunting or foraging. She was a testament to the sheer will to live, a kind of courage I had long forgotten. I asked without pushing. "Food?" Her hand shifted under the shawl. She drew out a small, intricately woven leather pouch and set it down. Inside, I glimpsed dried mesquite beans, bits of acorn meal, scraps of dried rabbit, barely enough. Enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. I cursed the desert again, and my own bad luck in losing my horse and the scant supplies it carried. That thought burned resources wasted in the dust, while she'd been scraping by here in the shadows. The silence stretched until Ayanna spoke again. Softer now, a confession. Husband, gone. She looked at the dying embers, not at me. Miners took him. Land. The words hit me harder than I expected. I shifted my jaw, staring at the flames. It was no surprise. Most women I had encountered on the frontier carried the same story, loss carved into them by the casual violence of expansion. Still, hearing it from her voice gave the ruin a heavier, more haunted air. I felt the familiar twist of shame and anger. Shame that men like me, white men, had been part of the system that allowed this, and anger that a woman had been left to hide in stone and dust because of it. I wanted to say something, a word of comfort, a promise, but words felt too thin, too easily broken. Instead, I reached for my pack, pulled out a small whetstone, and began sharpening my hunting knife. The strike of metal on stone echoed through the ruin, steady, purposeful. It was the only way I knew to answer. Action, not speech. Honor, demonstrated by the slow, honest rhythm of work. She watched me for a long while, then reached into her own bundle and pulled out a small bone needle and a thread made of plant fiber. Without asking, she picked up my coat, torn at the sleeve from my fall, and began stitching. That was how the morning passed. I sharpened metal. She mended cloth. The storm outside had dulled to a steady, hot breeze, the air still thick with sand, but not the savage roar of the night before. We did not speak again, but when the work was done, something between us had shifted. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of mutual respect, a tacit agreement that we both carried the scars of men's cruelty, and that we would not inflict more upon each other. When the light outside shifted to that brutal, blinding white that marked noon in the desert, I stood. I gestured toward the opening, lifting an eyebrow, asking without words if she wanted to come out. She shook her head, pulling the shawl tighter. I understood. If she had been hiding here for months, the outside world held nothing for her but danger, a danger likely worse than the elements. I stepped out alone, the heat cutting through my clothes, but the air was clear enough to see. I searched the immediate area, dragging back what dry scrub I could find beneath the rocks. When I returned, she had moved closer to the fire, the shawl fallen slightly. The deerskin dress beneath was worn and torn. Her skin caught the light, soft and vulnerable, in a way that made my chest tighten. I forced my eyes away, focusing on the fire. I had no right to look at her like that. My honor demanded restraint. That night, when darkness settled again, I made a place for myself farther from the fire, so she could keep the warmest spot. She glanced at me when I stretched out on the stone, my coat pulled over me, the Colt near my side. I saw the question in her eyes. Why not closer? Why not take what you can? But she didn't ask, and I didn't explain. I had no right to assume anything. My presence here was an act of sacrifice, a small offering of self-denial against the predatory instincts of the world outside. Sleep came slow. I kept listening to the faint rustle of her shawl, the sound of her breath. I thought of how easily I could ruin the fragile balance here. I turned on my side, facing the stone wall, jaw tight. I would not be the kind of man she feared. Near dawn, when the fire was ash and the desert cold had crept deep, I woke to find the shawl had shifted between us. She had left a corner of it extended, just within my reach, as though offering warmth without speaking. I hesitated, my hand hovering, then pulled it gently over my shoulders. She did not move, did not open her eyes, but her breathing remained steady. It was the smallest gesture, but in that frozen ruin, it was more than 1,000 words. It was the first fragile shape of trust. The shared shawl lingered in my mind when I woke fully. I rose slowly, the ache in my joints a familiar companion, and stepped toward the opening. The sun was higher now, the sand had settled, and the silence was absolute. I gathered wood, returned, and soon the fire was crackling. Ayana was sitting upright, watching me. She pulled her small clay pot from the corner and set it near the flames, adding water from a skin bag and stirring in the last scraps of dried mesquite. The smell of the thin broth soon filled the ruin, enough to stir a sharp, gnawing hunger. When the food was ready, she poured some into a wooden bowl, the only one she seemed to possess, and set it between us. I waited. She gave me a single glance, her chin dipping slightly, then drew the bowl closer to the fire where I could reach. I took a slow breath, picked it up, and sipped. The broth was thin, but warm enough to ease the tightness in my chest. I set it down and slid it back toward her. She finished it in small sips, never breaking eye contact for long. The silence between us stretched until I spoke again, my voice quiet. You said, miners. Which ones? Her eyes hardened. Dust Devil. Jedediah Ironstone, she said with venom. He wants the water, our land, said I must coerce a marriage, or lose all. The injustice of it, the claim jumping, and the attempt to take her land through a forced legal status landed on my shoulders. I felt the familiar heat of my old, buried anger rise. My silent, personal code of honor demanded that I recognize this injustice for what it was. No camp, she continued, her voice lower, more pained. No people left. He burned the papers. But I have one. The real one. Her hand moved quickly, drawing a small, tightly rolled piece of leather from the deepest folds of her shawl. A forged quitclaim would never hold against this. This is the deed. The thought of an easy escape vanished. My own past, the failure to protect the innocent at Washita, suddenly roared in my ears. This was not chance. This was a brutal opportunity for redemption. As if summoned by the very mention of his name, the sound of heavy boots and low voices broke the silence outside. Stone's men. Ayanna tensed, her face draining of color. Stone. I was on my feet instantly, moving silently to the narrow opening. 3 men. I spun back to Ayanna. They'll take you. Force the marriage. Take the land. We have seconds. I reached out, my hands firm on her shoulders. Listen to me, Ayanna. They can't claim you if you're already claimed. They think only of property. We'll give them that lie. I drew my Colt, held it low, and stood in the doorway. The leader stopped. We're looking for a squaw. Ayanna. She's Jed Stone's property now. Seen her? She's mine, I said, my voice low, rough, and absolute. Found her days ago. Took her off a couple of bandits near the canyon fork. Going to sell her back to her own people. The big man laughed. Sell her? Stone will buy her from you right now. A free woman isn't chattel. Any claim without her consent is void, I countered. I don't sell people to Stone. And this one, I lied again, the words tasting of ash and sacrifice. She's my chattel now. She owes me for the trouble. She belongs to Riker. The man hesitated, wary of a rival claim. Fine. But Stone doesn't forget. If you head toward Dust Devil Canyon, he'll take her from you by force or paper. He can try. When they retreated, I turned back to Ayanna. She was still sitting there, rigid. I took the scroll from her hand. They'll be back, I said. The lie bought us an hour. Maybe 2, we move now. With me. They think you're mine. That's the only protection you have left. She met my gaze, the fear receding, replaced by a fierce understanding. She nodded once, accepting the new, dangerous covenant between us. I had just staked my life, and whatever remains of my soul on her protection. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. The escape from the ruin was a blur of sun and choking dust. We moved like shadows, sticking to the deep cuts in the canyon where the rock offered both shade and cover. Ayanna was a revelation. She was not simply a frightened woman, but a desert-born spirit, her movements quick, her knowledge of the terrain absolute. She led, and I, the bounty hunter used to command, followed her every silent instruction. The small, tightly rolled deed to her land was tucked deep inside my shirt, a burning weight over my heart, a constant reminder of the oath I had inadvertently taken. The desert was unforgiving. The sun was a hammer, the heat a dry, sucking exhaustion that pulled the moisture from our bones. The silence of the open land was broken only by the rasp of our breathing and the crunch of our boots on the shale. We were running from a lie, but running into a truth, the raw, undeniable vulnerability of life without aid. The hours stretched into days. Our food was gone within the first 24 hours, the water from my canteen rationing out to mere sips that only heightened the ache of our thirst. Ayanna used her knowledge to find hidden reserves, a patch of cactus fruit, the sweet, life-saving moisture from the root of a desert plant. She sustained us, teaching me the language of her harsh home. The Odom were a desert people, Thou Nuk Va Loidida, skilled with water and rock paths, and her quiet competence shamed my dependence on a gun and a bottle. It was during one of those nights, huddled beneath a low rock overhang for meager shelter, that the psychological wall between us finally began to crumble. The moon was a cold disk of white light, and the desert wind was a low, mournful sigh that seemed to carry all the grief of the forgotten land. "He was my son," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, her eyes staring into the vast, indifferent darkness. "My husband, Hakan. He found the water. On the land. Stone." She choked on the name. "Jedediah Iron Stone. Set a trap. Said Hakan was stealing claim markers. My Hakan, he fought for his honor, but they were many. They left him for the buzzards. They think if I marry him, the land is clear, that they can coerce a marriage and complete their claim, jumping. The injustice of it was a physical blow. A man murdered for his integrity, a woman coerced into marriage for a spring. My own old wound, the failure at Washita, pulsed with fresh pain. I reached out, my calloused fingers finding the smooth, cool stone of her hand. I squeezed once, a silent acknowledgement of her pain, a promise of retribution. I didn't save the woman at Washita, I admitted, the words ripping out of my throat, coarse and ugly. The secret I had carried for years, the heavy weight of my shame, felt too large for the night. I was a soldier. I had orders. I saw the violence. I heard her cry. But I stood there. I was a coward wearing a uniform. That's why I hunt men now. For the penance. To find a way to balance the score. She turned to me then, her eyes dark pools of understanding, not judgment. "The scar," she said, her fingers lifting to touch the jagged line above my temple. "Not from the fight, from the regret. It is the same scar. We both carry the lost Sunday." Her words were simple, yet they cut through the layers of self-deception and isolation I had built up for years. For the first time, my regret didn't feel like a unique curse, but a shared experience, a terrible, binding wound. The honor I sought wasn't about the kill. It was about the sacrifice of my own solitude, the choice to stand guard over someone else's fragile justice. This was a weight a man can't set down. The test of that commitment came 2 days later, just as the last of the edible plants had been consumed. We were moving along a low ridge when Ayana spotted them 3 riders, Stone's men, the same cruel faces, moving fast, clearly tracking us this time. "They found the tracks again," I muttered, pushing her into the shadow of a low rock cluster. "They're circling. They know we can't be far from water." "The Black Butte," she whispered, pointing with her chin to a distant, imposing mesa. "There is a spring in the west face. They will go there." "They're coming this way," I said, drawing the Colt. The familiar weight was a comfort, a tool of my own distorted justice. "Stay low. If I can take out 2, the 3rd will run back to Stone." "No," she said, suddenly firmer, her hand gripping my arm. "They know you. They know your Colt. They will follow the gun. We must separate." "I can't leave you," I argued, the words a raw protest of my newly discovered duty. "You will not leave me," she corrected, her eyes burning with an intense focus. "You will draw them. Take the high ground. Make them chase the bounty hunter. I will go low, where the sand washes. I can hide. I have the paper. I will meet you at the Black Butte Spring, tomorrow when the sun is straight up." I hesitated. It was the only chance for her survival. If she escaped, she would have a chance to claim her justice. The decision was not about my life. It was about her freedom. Self-sacrifice for a greater cause, it was the highest form of honor I could now imagine. "Go," I said, nodding. My voice clipped. "If I'm not at the Black Butte, keep riding. Go to the railroad. Find a lawman outside of Dust Devil Canyon." I ran up the ridge, making sure the dust from my boots was visible, deliberately drawing their attention. The chase was quick and brutal. They saw me, cursed, and spurred their horses up the rocky slope. I dropped into a firing position behind a cluster of boulders, waiting until the closest man was in range. The Colt cracked, the sound echoing savagely across the silent desert. The first man went down, his horse rearing and throwing him. The other 2 scattered. but they had the advantage of the higher ground in numbers. A bullet whizzed past my ear, chipping rock just inches from my face. I fired again, missing this time. I was exposed. I had to move. I scrambled up the backside of the ridge, intending to create distance, but as I crested the rise, I wasn't quick enough. A flash of light, a roar, and a searing, white-hot pain exploded in my side. I went down hard. The wind knocked out of me, the smell of burnt gunpowder and my own blood filling my nostrils. The Colt slipped from my grasp, sliding down the loose rock. I rolled onto my back, drawing a ragged breath, fighting the blackness that threatened to consume me. I was done. I had failed again. Even in this act of sacrifice, the ghost of the Washita woman was finally coming to claim me. Just as a shadow fell over me, and I braced for the final blow, a sound came, not a shot, but a sharp, cutting thwack. A gasp, a thud, then a shout of surprise, followed by the rapid pounding of retreating hooves. I blinked, fighting the pain. Standing over me, clutching the obsidian knife, her chest heaving, was Ayanna. She had taken a terrible risk, circled back, and ambushed the nearest man, not killing him, but wounding him enough to drive both men off in a panic. The other two hadn't expected the quarry to fight back. She had saved my life. The vulnerable woman had risked everything for the man who was supposed to protect her. She knelt beside me, her eyes frantic. She tore a strip from her shawl, her hands surprisingly steady, and pressed it against the gaping, bloody hole in my side. The pain was excruciating, and I bit back a cry. "You should have gone," I gasped, the words tasting like copper. "The paper, the deed." "The paper is nothing," she said fiercely, her voice tight with suppressed tears and fear. "Only a thing. You are the oath. You are the man of honor." She looked at my eyes, full of pain and self-loathing. "You stood at the Washita. You chose to carry the scar. You chose to protect me. You are not a coward." Her fingers, stained with my blood, found the deep, jagged scar above my temple, the mark of my old regret. She touched it, then slid her hand down to my jaw, her touch firm, an assertion of my worth, a final, beautiful act of absolution. "No more grief," she whispered, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of dry desert air and wild sage. "You are not a coward. You are Riker. You are here." The pain, the shock, the heat, and the sudden, profound release of years of guilt finally overwhelmed me. I passed out, but as the blackness claimed me, I knew I was not alone. The burden of my past had been lifted by the smallest, most courageous woman in the American West. I had risked my life to earn my honor back, and in turn, she had given me the redemption I sought. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." I woke up to the smell of damp earth and the metallic tang of dried blood. I was lying in a narrow, cool crevice, hidden from the brutal sun, deep within the base of the Black Butte. My side was tightly bound with what felt like strips of linen torn from Ayanna's precious shawl, and a poultice of chewed leaves, bitter and strong, was pressed against the wound. I tried to move, and a sharp, blinding pain shot through my body, forcing a strangled curse from my lips. Ayanna was instantly beside me. She pressed a cup, a piece of hollowed gourd, to my lips. The water was cool, sweet, and pure. It was from the hidden spring. "You are safe," she said, her voice rough. "They are gone. I waited. I healed you. We are at the spring." For 3 days, she worked, a tireless sentinel. She hunted small creatures with snares, using her bone needle to stitch closed the worst of the wound, and applied fresh poultices. I was helpless, completely dependent on her, a humbling, raw experience for a man who had built his life on self-reliance and strength. But in my weakness, I saw her strength,